class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 26 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Seattle Kraken and won by a score of 8-5. It was just a couple of days ago the Sharks faced off against the Ottawa Senators and played what was their best game of the season, and perhaps one of the best games that this team has played in a very, very long time, and yet they ended up losing that game. And I mentioned how in the NHL sometimes you can seemingly do everything right and still end up on the losing side of things. But another tendency in the NHL is that things usually tend to balance out over a full 82-game season. It can take a few months, it can take a few weeks, or sometimes it can take until just the very next game. And that was the case here tonight, or today, for the San Jose Sharks. A couple of days ago against Ottawa, the Sharks needed a picture-perfect tic-tac-toe type of play to even have a chance of beating Senators goaltender Linus Ullmark. But here today against Seattle, they were shooting from all angles from pretty far out, and they were usually going in. To put it quite bluntly, Philip Grubauer couldn't seem to stop a beach ball in this game. And the Sharks, that is really what helps them run up the score here. Honestly, I don't think they were nearly as good tonight as they were in that game against Ottawa, but as I mentioned, what goes around comes around, and the Sharks take advantage of the luck, so to speak, that they were given. This one starts off with an early strike yet again, this one coming from Timothy Liljegren on a goal very similar to the one he had just a couple of games ago against the Los Angeles Kings, and it is 1-0 San Jose, but a Sharks tendency that has existed for the entirety of this season. It is way too often that it has happened that you could no longer consider this a coincidence. It seems to be a very real issue that this team has. It is Bjorkstrand who responds less than a minute later and ties the game up at 1. Kostin would then take the lead back for the Sharks, but again, less than a minute later, Seattle's on the board once more, and then eventually it is Shane Wright on the power play, and the Sharks are trailing 3-2 in the first. This was not a badly played first period for San Jose. They had their looks, they had their chances, just a couple of mistakes standing out, and so they are in a 1-goal deficit. But it was the second period where things seemed to fall apart for the Kraken goaltender. Of the 4 goals that the Sharks would end up scoring, he probably could have made the save on at least 3 of them, if not every single one of them. Though you do have to credit San Jose for at least picking the holes that existed on net. It is Will Smith who scores first to tie this one up. Shane Wright then gets another power play goal. The Sharks had some very real penalty troubles in this game, and it is 4-3 Seattle. But then it is Wallman, Granlund, and Celebrini who build up a 6-4 goal lead for the Sharks. Though in the last couple of minutes, the Kraken do get back to within 1. They catch the Sharks on a very, very long shift, especially for their defensive pairing, and this could have been the type of goal that really shifted momentum back in favor of Seattle, heading quickly right into the second intermission. It would not have been that much of a surprise if the Kraken came out fully re-energized in this third period and really pushing, but the Sharks, they handled things well, and honestly, while the Kraken got maybe a couple of looks here or there, they didn't actually get much generated in those final 20 minutes. It would be only the Sharks who would manage to get a goal on a manned net in that last period, coming from Ethan Cardwell back into the lineup after the injury to Barclay Goodrow. He's now on the injured reserve. He draws in and he scores his first career goal, so congratulations to him. And eventually Jake Wallman adds an empty netter, his second goal of the night, and it is an 8-5 win for San Jose. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Eklund, Zetterlund, and they're joined by Celebrini yet again, which was a potential surprise here for this game because Granlund did return to the lineup, and so nobody would have necessarily blamed Warsofsky if he decided to just reunite the Lund line that had previously had success for multiple weeks, and of course was, even going back to last year, a solid lineup for the Sharks. But since this top line of Eklund, Celebrini, and Zetterlund was so incredibly impactful in the previous game against Ottawa, Warsofsky could not possibly justify separating the 3 players, and honestly, I definitely am in agreement of that. I wanted to see what these 3 players could do, and the first thing to say is that obviously they couldn't live up to the insane hype of that previous game. That's not a surprise. The Senators looked lazy and slow at times in that previous game. That was not really going to happen with another NHL team. The Kraken were more on top of things, and so we didn't really get to see as much flow with this top line, and while that did kind of work to make Celebrini and Eklund slow down a little bit, it did actually work in the favor of Fabian Zetterlund. I talked about in the previous game that when the Sharks are given this room to work with, Celebrini and Eklund really thrive with that open space, but Zetterlund is having a difficulty actually managing to keep up. But in this one here tonight, where things were a little bit more chippy, there wasn't as much space on the ice, you had to work for your time, Zetterlund actually managed to have a lot of success. I won't go so far as to say he was the best player on this top line, but I will say it was significantly closer than it was in the previous game. I was a big fan of what Zetterlund was managing to do throughout this entire game with his little fishbowl helmet. When it comes to the two other players, we do have Macklin Celebrini, another couple of points picked up here as he continues to try and really come back in the rookie scoring race after having missed 12 games already due to injury. He picks up a goal, he picks up an assist as well. That goal was nice for sure, but one that Grubauer may have been able to stop. I actually really want to talk more so about this assist. Now, this is a secondary assist, and a lot of hockey analysts, some pundits, while technically the NHL counts all assists as the same, a lot of these analysts will say, well, a secondary assist is so much more useless than a primary assist, and usually you can agree with that. Sometimes that third player touching the puck doesn't really make a huge impact on the play, but in this case, very much not the case. Celebrini, the only reason this goal ends up happening is because he wins this battle against Brandon Tanev, who's maybe not the best player in the NHL, obviously, but he's a tougher guy who's difficult to separate from the puck, and so the 18-year-old managing to win that, which is maybe not that much of a surprise considering he is amongst the league leaders in terms of puck battles won per game. He gets this one in the neutral zone, he works it up to Eklund, and then of course the rest is history here, picking up that secondary assist. So great way for him to pick up a point in that area, showing that it's not always just the incredibly skilled plays of carrying this in with a controlled zone entry, but sometimes it's just the hard work that does pay off. Now, one thing to note here about Celebrini is that in the previous game against Ottawa, he ended up with 25.5 minutes of ice time, an incredibly high amount for any player, and especially for a forward. But tonight against Seattle, or today against Seattle, he only ends up with just under 16 minutes of ice time. This is almost a 10-minute difference from the previous game. Now, of course, in this one, the Sharks actually spent about half of the game here with a lead, so he's not being relied on as heavily. But it should also be noted that the Sharks, this is the first half of a back-to-back with travel. They will be playing in Seattle tomorrow, and so this is an opportunity to perhaps not try to fully tire out one of your best players, if not your best player. So he gets a bit less ice time, but he still manages to make things happen with it. And then when it comes to William Eklund, he also continues his hot streak, picks up yet another couple of assists here. He continues to be right up there in terms of point scoring. This was the exact William Eklund that we were hoping to see this season. He had about 45 points last year, and coming into this one, we were hoping for that step forward, and we have absolutely gotten that. He's looked engaged in most of the games he has managed to play this season. He found some solid chemistry, of course, with Macklin Celebrini, and it was just another good effort for him. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Cunnin, Wenberg, and Toffoli. Now, you could certainly consider this the third line, considering Mikael Granlund is the Sharks' leading scorer. You might want to have that sort of habit of saying that whatever line he happens to be on is probably a top six line, but considering the ice time amongst these players, it does feel as though Warsofsky treated this Wenberg line more so as a top six one, and they were okay. It's the type of performance for a line in which, because the Sharks actually won this game, you can't be too upset about what they managed to do. But if the Sharks, for instance, were struggling to score throughout this one, if Grubauer was looking a lot better than he actually did, if he was playing more of a Linus Ullmark style of game, this would probably be a line that you looked at and were hoping for more offensive jump from them. They started this game off pretty well. For instance, Toffoli, that great assist on the Liljegren goal, and we saw Cunnin also end up getting a good chance just a couple of minutes later, but it felt as though a lot of this game was actually played throughout the neutral zone for these three players, and you want to see a bit more offensive zone time, especially since it is a line that does feature one of your leading scorers, Toffoli, and a decent offensive player as well in Wenberg. When it comes from an individual standpoint, I continue to appreciate Luke Cunnin's game here. Not maybe as high as the level as it had been previously, but he has still managed to not find himself looking completely out of place on this second line. Now, that could have something to do with the fact that the other two players weren't doing much offensively, so there wasn't an opportunity for Cunnin to look a little bit out of place, but still, it has been a decent look for sure over these last few games, and I can understand why Warsofsky didn't want to separate this line either. When it comes to the opposite winger, we do have Tyler Toffoli an okay game. He picks up that assist. Again, it goes back to what I just mentioned earlier on, where if this was one the Sharks were struggling to score, you would have hoped for more from Toffoli, but I guess it's all right as more of like a shutdown defensive line. And that's exactly the type of effort that, for instance, Alex Wenberg managed to bring to this game. Did some solid things defensively, so you can't be too hard on this second line, but you do want to definitely see more as things move forward. Then we get to the Sharks' third line. It is Will Smith. He finds himself with Klim Kostin, which was two players that were put together once Barclay Goodrow sustained that injury in the earlier parts of last game. And they are joined by Mikael Granlund. So this is a sort of third line, and that has been heavily loaded up. Granlund is the Sharks' leading scorer. You would expect himself to find himself in that top six, but since those two previous lines were so good in the previous game, not the case. And because of Granlund's appearance on this second line, or this third line, it really did thrive. We'll start off with Will Smith, who continues his mini hot streak as well. Like with Celebrini, like with Eklund, he picks up a couple of points, that goal, as well as an assist. Interestingly enough, as I mentioned with Celebrini, his ice time a little bit low here tonight, ends up with just under 12 minutes, but it is the first half of a back-to-back. Now, in previous back-to-backs that the Sharks have had this season, Will Smith has been a healthy scratch in one of those two games. And so it has always been viewed as this kind of development day to ease him into the NHL. But eventually, he has to play in a second half of a back-to-back or a first half of a back-to-back. You can't just constantly shield him from these situations that are going to happen at least, 10 or so times every single year. At some point, you have to kick him out of the nest and see if he can fly on his own. And so I think that is the approach Warsofsky is taking, and that is why, even though Smith was looking very good here tonight, that he's actually only limited to about 12 minutes of ice time. It's so that they don't end up tiring him out, at least slightly, and that he can end up being in the lineup. I will not even remotely understand, not only because of the lower ice time here tonight, but just generally because he has been on this hot streak, I will not even remotely understand if Warsofsky does decide to have him benched yet again. This is finally that chance to say, hey, you get to play back-to-back, even if there is this travel. When it comes on the other side of things, we do have Klim Kostin. This was the exact type of Kostin the Sharks were hoping for coming into this season. Not so much to be like a top six forward, but that he could be a bottom six player who can use his body, who can use his talent to actually bring a bit of an offensive spark to a Sharks bottom six that otherwise may not have had it. When you're surrounded by players like Sturm and Grundstrom and Dellandrea, these types of guys, they're not bad players, but they don't really have much offensive talent. Kostin was supposed to be that guy. And for the first parts of this season, the large first month of the year, Kostin was not only not doing that, but was actually a liability on the ice. But he's been a lot better as of late. And compared to last game, where there were still those couple of standout mistakes, here tonight he was a lot more trustworthy. He picks up his first goal of the season. Nice to see him get rewarded. He also picks up an assist. He also ends up getting in a fight for a Gordie Howe hat trick. And while he does pick up a minor penalty with it, which is not really going to help his penalty minutes as a percentage of ice time, considering it kind of shows to be still a little bit undisciplined, it's not really the end of the world, and perhaps I'm sure the Sharks staff and players are not that upset to see him actually stand up for his teammates, and generally it was a good game for Kostin. And then when it comes to Mikael Granlund, maybe not having the same type of success he was having earlier this season prior to injury, but that is to be expected considering he's no longer playing with two guys he had been attached at the hip to recently with Eklund and Zetterlund, finding himself with newer line mates. I don't think Granlund has played with Kostin really at all this season, and he hasn't played with Smith in a very, very long time, since like game 1 of the regular season. It would take a little bit of time to find chemistry, yet Granlund still did not look a bit out of place at all, managed to pick up this goal and help set up what was perhaps the Sharks' most effective line of the night. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Sturm with Dellandrea, and they are joined by Ethan Cardwell. So with Goodrow going down, even though the San Jose Sharks and Ryan Warsofsky seem to like playing Goodrow as a top six forward, considering he has gotten the ice time for that and the power play ice time for that, it turns out that he's actually not really a skilled player. And so when you're replacing him in the lineup, you bring up another kind of like bottom six type of guy. And that is what Ethan Cardwell, the role he fits in very well. And I thought Cardwell looked quite good here tonight. His even strength play wasn't super spectacular. Neither was the case for this fourth line, but what I really did appreciate is his effort on the penalty kill. The fact that he's coming up and he's playing his first few games here. I think this is his third game in the NHL of his career, and he's already being put into these really tough situations where you need to have a lot of trust in the coaching staff in you, and he's having success. I like the energy he brings in that area. So while his even strength play wasn't great, he does have a solid penalty killing night. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, congratulations to him for that first career goal. I'm sure that's going to be a memory for him. And it is interesting to actually talk about what exactly the Sharks are going to end up doing with their lineup when everybody is healthy again. Because once Goodrow does come back in a few games or whatever, obviously he can replace Cardwell. But the healthy scratch here tonight was actually Carl Grundstrom. And Grundstrom, while he has been a little bit slow over this last week or so, and that is probably the reason he ends up getting healthy scratch tonight, he has been mostly good as of late. And so you can no longer just have the easy healthy scratch of Klim Kostin, because right now he's looking very, very good, and he's definitely your best scoring option of the sort of bottom six type of guys that the Sharks have. So is Grundstrom just going to be continuously riding the bench? Obviously, if Goodrow is out longer term, we don't really have to think about this, and while he's on IR, we know he's going to be missing the next couple of games, but at some point he will return, the Sharks will be fully healthy, and there will be a decision to make. When it comes to the other two players on this line, Sturm, Dellandrea, I thought they looked all right. As I mentioned, it wasn't the most effective even strength game for this Sharks fourth line, but I don't think they were terrible either. Then we move on to the defensive side of things. We have the first pairing of Wallman and Ceci. Do have to talk a little bit about Cody Ceci, because there were moments in this game for sure in which the Kraken, they managed to score 5 goals here, 2 of them on the power play, so maybe not so much to say there, but at even strength there were mistakes being made. And we take a look at the Stevenson goal for this situation, because honestly this is kind of up in the air. I see a lot of people really blaming Cody Ceci, and I could definitely see why that might be the case on the surface, but in the NHL, teams don't usually win face-offs cleanly. It obviously happens occasionally. You'll see it a few times per game, but a lot of the times you want your wingers and even your defensemen, at least from a defensive standpoint, like when you're in the defensive zone for these face-offs, to actually step in and help out on the draw. And that's exactly what Cody Ceci tries to do in this situation, and it seemed as though he'd be able to dig this puck out and get an easy clear, but as he moves up to do so, the puck is put away from him slightly, and it is Stevenson who's then able to pick it up and score, with Cody Ceci now out of position. So you could very well argue that Ceci should stay back, play it a lot more safe, and not try to help out in that position. But for all we know, the coaching staff may have been really drilling it into Ceci that in a situation like that, he should be trying to step up. So I don't really blame Ceci as much. And then besides that one shift, I thought he was actually all right enough throughout this game. Obviously, he does take the penalty that does lead to one of these power play goals. That's not great to see. So it wasn't a great game for Ceci, or even a particularly good one, but he was all right. When it comes to his defensive partner, Jake Wallman, obviously a very successful night offensively, not any super major mistakes like we had seen in that previous game against Ottawa, so definitely can't be too upset with him. He continues to just rack up these points. I think he's now up at 17 points, 17 or 18 points on the season. I had a bold prediction coming into this year that he would manage to get 40. That is no longer looking all that bold, because he's on pace to hit up to what now, especially since he missed about 5 games, he's on pace to hit up at about 60-ish points, 70-ish points even perhaps. So looking really good thus far, this pickup for the San Jose Sharks from the Red Wings this past offseason. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Liljegren now in the correct positions. Ferraro left defenseman, Liljegren right defenseman. When it comes to Liljegren, nice to see him manage to get this goal, the first one of the game, the first of 8 for San Jose. But one thing that I did notice here tonight from a defensive standpoint is that it felt as though Liljegren was just a little bit too passive at times. It felt as though he was playing just a bit too deep on when the Kraken were rushing into the zone. It felt as though Liljegren was playing a bit too deep. I want to see him actually step up and challenge in a lot of these positions. It's something that you very frequently see Wallman do, but that you also see players like Ferraro and Ruda do when the time is right. And Liljegren, he was doing that in previous games, but for whatever reason tonight, it felt as though he was indeed just a bit too passive, which caused some extra zone time for Seattle. So a bit of a small error, I would say, throughout the night for Liljegren, but not a bad game for him. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, definitely not nearly as good as his previous game against Ottawa, which is very much the case for pretty much every player here tonight. As I mentioned, Ottawa, it was kind of a special game in which the Sharks were just so fantastic and dominating over the Ottawa Senators. Here in a much closely played game, Ferraro's not going to be able to find the same level of success. But while I don't think he was at that high level, I don't think he was nearly at the low level we have previously seen from him this season. I still think it was a decent enough game for Mario Ferraro. There were mistakes for sure. We'll actually, like we did with CC, talk about this Bjorkstrand goal because I think a lot of people had a tendency to blame Ferraro in this situation. Now, this is a goal that looks kind of similar to the one scored by Josh Norris last game, in which I was very criticizing of Jake Wallman for stepping up very aggressively, but there are some slight differences compared to the situations. First of all, the Sharks were not shorthanded here, so that is a bigger deal. You are playing for a little bit more offense at even strength compared to shorthanded, but also in that Josh Norris goal, Dellandrea was in a 50-50 puck battle. There was no guarantee, very far from it, that the Sharks would come out with the puck, and so Wallman stepping up there was a very risky play. Here in this situation, Ferraro does step up in a similar manner, though even still not nearly as aggressive as Wallman, but this is because Smith seemingly has full control of the puck. This should be an easy clear for the Sharks, but the puck seems to bounce over the stick of Will Smith, and then because of this bouncing puck, he ends up making a very weak pass to the middle, which leads to this giveaway. I really honestly don't blame Ferraro much in this situation. Now, this wasn't the only mistake that stood out. There was one in which he does step up in the neutral zone to try and catch a puck high in the air, and he misses it completely, which leads to a 2-on-0 for Seattle. That doesn't lead to anything, but still a dangerous play. So it was not a great game for Ferraro, but he was still all right. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda. And I actually thought both of these players were quite good for San Jose. Thrun did have the mistake on the Shane Wright second power play goal. This is a pass that should never be able to get through, and Thrun, I think, is just not having his stick in the correct position. He should have he has a stick to the right of himself. He should have it to the left so that he cuts out this lane, because Stevenson should not be able to pass right in front of the crease to Shane Wright. It's an impossible save for Vitek Vanacek, so a small mistake there, but otherwise I thought Thrun looked good. And then Jan Ruda as well, I thought played another pretty decent game. In the earlier parts of this season, Jan Ruda, the major problem for him is that he was paired with Ferraro, and as such they were constantly hemmed into their own zone, that in the very few times that they would actually end up clearing this puck out, he would be in such a long shift that he was essentially just hoping his forwards could get it deep enough that he could go off for a change. But now, playing in a bit of an easier role, there are times, and the Sharks of course just generally improving at forward on top of that, there are times in which Ferraro can Ruda can actually step up in more of a aggressive way and actually show off a little bit of an offensive flair. We've seen him make moves in the neutral zone. We've seen him jump up into the play offensively, which has looked a lot better. Now, I do think that Warsofsky does need to avoid falling into a trap here. Ruda has shown a lot of success when playing like 13 to 16 minutes of ice time. Here tonight he ends up with just over 18, which I think is a little bit too high for Ruda. I hope that does end up coming down a little bit as we move forward, because as we have seen already through the first at least 15 or so games of this season, Ruda is not a top 4 defenseman. He needs to be playing a bottom pairing role if you want him to have any sort of success, and he's been doing that over the last few games. This is not a situation where you should say, Ruda's playing well, let's get him back on the second pairing of Ferraro. Let's avoid that. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Vitek Vanacek. It wasn't a great game for him, obviously, lets in 5 goals, but at the same time, hard to really put too much blame on him in this situation. The Bjorkstrand goal is a very tough save. The first Shane Wright goal is pretty much an impossible one off the backboards. The second one, also an extremely difficult save. The Stevenson one, he probably could have had that, but still not the end of the world. And then the final goal scored here by Gord is also going to be a bit of a difficult one. So it's a situation where could Vanacek have played better? Yes, but I won't put too much blame on him. That will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. They'll be facing off against this very same Seattle Kraken team. The Kraken will have their actual starter in net, Joey Decord, for that one, and I imagine he's going to be at least a little bit better than Grubauer, so we should probably not expect this high scoring of a game, but hopefully some of the Sharks' younger players, like we have been seeing as of late, can continue their recent success. Class dismissed.